is I think that as a people of faith, we're in a position to recognize that there is something, seriously wrong, and that what's wrong is not just it's not some problem to be fixed out there in the world somewhere, but that we recognize that all of us are complicit in using other people for our own ends, basically, would be a simple way of saying it.
I am Lawrence Payne, a proud graduate of the University of St. Thomas, class of 1972. Please join us each week for a wonderful program here at Mac Studios from our campus, entitled For Such a Time as This. Each week we examine with our guests the social, economic, spiritual, and emotional issues that we face as human beings. Our discussions are rooted in unconditional love. We look at the 2 feet of Catholic social teaching, charity, and justice. Please join us here from Mac Studio for Such a Time as This. Good afternoon and welcome to this segment of For Such a Time as This, Living in New Knowledge. We're coming to you from the wonderful campus of the University of St. Thomas, soon to be coming from our new Mac Studio. We are very proud to present this series through the University of St. Thomas, entitled For Such a Time as This. We cover each week a myriad of subjects and guests covering the greater Houston area and beyond, and to look at issues that impact our lives as human beings trying to live, work together in this society, in this very divided society. And what are we called particularly to do as our response as Christians? It is an interesting thing to look at the plight of human beings and look at the plight of human beings from all being equal with equity and equality, and to begin to explore some of those things as to why it's not happening and why, quite frankly, it hadn't happened for years and years and years and years to come, even though we profess that we care deeply about all human beings' lives. All human beings matter, all human beings are equal, but yet the inequities, inequalities, disparities that we have just continue not only to grow and grow, but seemingly in certain areas to only get worse. So I took the opportunity to seize the moment for creativity and initiative by being on the island, on Galveston Island last Saturday for Juneteenth. Early in the morning, I didn't get to stay for the actual official dedication. Early in the morning, I drove down before it got warm, took my picture in front of the wonderful Absolute Equality mural, spent about a couple hours on the island, had breakfast there at my favorite place, the Old Mexican Cafe, and came back to Houston. But on the way out, I picked up the Galveston News for the weekend. And as I read the Galveston News for the weekend, the Sunday edition, there was this wonderful commentary that fits so well in the conversation I want to have this afternoon by none other than the Reverend Jonathan Totty, who is the Rector of Grace Episcopal Church there in Galveston, Texas. He also served on the Juneteenth Legacy Project. He actually is new to the island, which is a great way to introduce him, dive in on feet first and everything else, to Galveston and to the reality of Galveston. But I'm so glad that he agreed to be my guest this afternoon on For Such a Time as This. Let me just stop there and welcome Father Jonathan. How are you?
Thank you. Well, I'm doing very well. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I think this is just one of those moments. I think it was very fortuitous that I picked up the paper on the way out of the city and read your commentary. Let's talk about, first of all, a little bit. You have been working with the Juneteenth Legacy Project, getting really ramped up for this year's Juneteenth celebration, and hopefully that the national holiday would be done in time, and it was. And so this must have been just a great, exciting time on the island, because the island has been trying to deal with, promote, wrestle with Juneteenth for I don't know how many years. Mm-hmm. But there seemed to be a breakthrough this year.
Yeah, well, actually, so my role was very small. I'll say my role was very small because I came into this so late. I didn't actually get on to the island until March 1st. Okay. And I think they started painting the mural just like a week after. And when I got to Grace, not really knowing anybody in the community or what was going on, one of the first things that I did was call some of my own folks together and said, what can we do in terms of mission and outreach? And somehow Sam Collins, who was very influential in the Absolute Equality mural and the Juneteenth Legacy Project, Sam got invited to this meeting. For the next hour and a half or 2 hours, Sam told me about what they had been doing here. And I was sold that this was a great outreach for our church. Grace is a historic church that is all wrapped up in the island's history for good or for ill. It's just what it is, sort of thing. So my part was small in just getting us, Grace, and the two other Episcopal churches here on the island to give a donation, and sort of got a conversation going between the diocese and Sam as well. And I know the Diocese of Texas also gave a donation. And then starting to talk more with Sam about what comes next. So that's sort of your question, right? Here we've got this mural. What's the next steps? And in Sam's own words, now this year, coming out of the unrest that happened in 2019, 2020, Juneteenth is popular in a way that it wasn't before. And so there's the fear, or there is the danger that we'll just tick this box off. Okay, Juneteenth's now a national holiday. It's popular. People like to talk about it, but nothing will actually happen in the sense of making our communities stronger or more unified. And so that's sort of the work that I really want to participate in with Sam and others here in Galveston, other churches, and secular folks alike, just whatever we have to do to move forward, because this community is very diverse and has a lot of history of at times working very well together and at other times not working very well together. So,
well, and the three Episcopal churches on the island, to their credit, have worked together over the years, I know, in different projects. And the Diocese of Texas has put together this fund, I guess it's called Race and Reconciliation Effort, a great effort that they put together with funds behind it to do various works of reconciliation across the diocese. And Bishop Doyle, who I got to work and serve with, he was on my I chaired the Houston, the Mayor's Task Force on Police Reform here in Houston. And Bishop Doyle was on the task force. And we talked a lot about what his vision was in creating this fund and doing great work around this issue. But let's take it from this perspective. And you mentioned this, I think, in your commentary. Race and reconciliation work is really at the heart of the Christian gospel. There should be no hesitation, no reason not to pursue this work, even from a deeply social justice perspective, if one can use that word without it being seen as a dirty word, and dive deeply into this, should it not?
Yeah, I think so. So that was the approach that I took. And I think what often happens is that people think this conversation is a political conversation. Mm-hmm. And they sort of miss that most of what we call politics now is something we have created in the secular realm to sort of be cordoned off from the rest of human life. But really, politics is just about how do we live with our neighbors? How do we live well and with the people around us? How do we deal with the people who don't live next to us? How do we live with people that are different than us? And of course, Christianity, or the Christian theological tradition, speaks about all of these things, in a robust manner. So we could start with, what does it mean to take a Christian view of what it is to be a human person, and how that already includes being human in community, that as Christians, we don't think that you really can do this life on your own. Mm-hmm. And then we have this notion that, we have to rather love our neighbors to be able to love God. What does that look like? And then, of course, the words of Jesus makes that injunction upon us even more difficult, because he basically makes our enemies synonymous with our neighbors. So if we don't love our neighbors and our enemies as ourselves, how can we truly love God? So, I do think that there's a lot of resources within the Christian tradition, the theological tradition, about how to address this present moment in time. What does it mean for us to live well together?
Mm-hmm. And the question, I guess, that leads me to is that it is about human beings flourishing. we have accepted human beings surviving, even helping them work toward thriving. Just human beings are meant to flourish to the fullest of their God-given potential in every aspect of their being as human beings. And it is our job, our duty, yea, I say our obligation, to make sure that that happens for each human being. And we talk about that as something we should do as church, parish, temple, synagogue, or mosque. It happens only from a charity perspective and social service, but not from a justice perspective. And so we'll never get that full human flourishing until we address the justice issues that keep human beings from flourishing and not just thriving or surviving.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you think of just taking scripture, say, from the book of Acts. This seems to be the Christian vision, or the way that the apostles and the early church thought it meant to follow in the way of Jesus, was to develop these communities that took care of the poor, and they took care of each other in radical ways, and sometimes in the book of Acts, sharing all that they had together. They were willing to commit their lives to one another, sort of thing. And I think that, there's a lot at play in our own time, in the sense that as modern people, we have become more and more atomized. That is, we think of ourselves as individuals, and we think about what it means to flourish, even in the terms of what does it mean for me to flourish as an individual. But that's really foreign to the gospel concept of flourishing, that there is no flourishing apart from flourishing together.
Right.
And so, I think if there isn't then some justice component, or some component of restitution, of making things right. This is the word that the New Testament uses, right, for justification, or it's the same word for righteousness. One of the versions, dikaisune. How is God making things right? Right. A part of that, the church has always thought, was in and through our living together in the presence of Jesus, because we believe that we have been given the Holy Spirit. So how are we living into that calling of our Christian identity on a daily basis? How do we do that as a community? I think that does get to the heart of this issue, yes.
Do you think we're so locked into I and meism and materialism that the ability to see and speak in terms of we and us, and to guarantee everybody in pursuit of happiness for we and us, it seems to me where we went off the rail a little bit is when we bought into this prosperity gospel and materialistic stuff, and it became really an I and me vertical relationship with my God, as opposed to the horizontal relationship with my neighbors to my left and right. And that's hard, it seems, to get back to, because we're so locked into that now.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, you can see it in all of our discourse. So, even in discourse towards good things, we have a tendency to speak in terms of rights. We think rights are held by individuals. How we don't often speak, but I think is a more Christian way of speaking, is not so much in terms of rights, but just in terms of sheer existence as a gift. Creation is a gift. And then how do we participate in this gift economy? Well, that means that we are obligated, just because our fellow human beings, it's not that they have some rights that we've constructed, but because they're a human, we're obligated to take care of them. We're obligated to take care of creation for the same reason. I think then we start seeing ourselves as intrinsically a part of these communities, rather than our societies or communities as, pure constructs, things that we have kind of, we've created or we've made up. And I think that's what that rights discourse does more. It's like somewhere along the way, we thought these values were the most important things. We're going to say maybe they're even unalienable rights, but it's still this, we're operating as if we have to identify these rights, and then the law legislates or says that you have them or don't have them, et cetera. Whereas I think an older, more Christian way of thinking is to say, well, no, actually, we're obligated to take care of one another in the social sphere. This is obviously going to entail some large amount of justice. And since we have to make sure the social aspect of who we are, or the communal aspect of who we are, is right and functioning well, so that we become fully human, that we're able to flourish, that we're able to grow into the people that God would have us to be.
Is it time to have, from a religious perspective, when I say religious, I mean all denominations, all faiths, to have the discussion that we seem to not want to have as people of faith, and listen about what is the fair, moral, ethical treatment of all human beings? What does that baseline look like? What is that minimum thing that we as a society should be able to assure for all human beings, and begin to really work toward that goal? Because we keep talking about it around the fringes, around the edges of what should happen, what ought to happen, how it should happen, but we don't take any action around it. And so we live in this world of false hope and false optimism, as you talked about, and we get stuck there. We get stuck on hope. We get stuck on false optimism. I was always taught that hope is not a state of mind. Hope is not an emotion or a feeling. Hope is a state of action. Consistent, constant action to make happen what you're hoping and praying for every day. It's just not going to happen. And so I think as we start training people again, educating people, making people aware, and helping them live in new knowledge, in our changing demographic society, it seems to me that's about the only way we can go if we have a chance of human beings mutually working out their existence and coexistence together.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I had that phrase. I think it may actually be a title of a book that I've never read, Hope Without Optimism. What I was getting at, and is very much in line with what you just said, is I think that as a people of faith, we're in a position to recognize that there is something, seriously wrong, and that what's wrong is not just it's not some problem to be fixed out there in the world somewhere. But that we recognize that all of us are complicit in using other people for our own ends, basically, would be a simple way of saying it. Now, because of the way our history, American history, has gone, that looks like some communities being much more complicit in to the detriment of whole other groups of people. I mean, you look at the history of slavery, you look at the history of westward expansion, you look at et cetera. You could go on and talk about all of these different things. So that adds a whole nother layer that we are complicit in the benefits of these structures, whether we realize it or not, and how are we going to move forward. But at the end of the day, it's like, well, none of that stuff changes if we just can't even stop and say, well, something is wrong. It's not just a problem out there, but it's also how I relate to relations of power, how I relate to relations of, what's the structures and the way my own community is set up, the way I understand who I am in that community, and even perhaps just how I feel about other people. Well, as Christians, we have a really wonderful vocabulary for this. We just call it original sin. And we've been talking about it for a really long time, right? Original sin isn't something that you are responsible for in the sense that you went out and did something wrong. But we still think we need salvation from that. I think people of faith across the board are willing to have that conversation. But what's odd, or interesting, maybe is the better word for it, is that now I sense a lot of the pushback against conversations about justice or racial reconciliation is people want to define racism as an action one does or does not commit, or you either are or are not a racist person. Well, you could ask a room full of people, are you racist? And they might all say no. I don't think racist things. I don't do racist things. And that might even be true, but that doesn't mean that you might not still have a systemic racism problem. I think the vocabulary of original sin already helps Christians have this conversation. You may go days without sinning. You may be much holier than me in that way, but that doesn't mean that we don't still have a problem, that we don't need to be saved. And then the language of Christianity, of course, we think that the salvation comes from God, and ultimately what we are meant to be is people, fully human people who look like Jesus Christ, who in some way have overcome sin and death and evil, in and through being transformed. So it's not just, the problem out there has been fixed, but it's a problem within ourselves that has been fixed as well. And so, I think all of that outlines that this issue is a lot harder than anybody wants to admit, because it means we have to deal with actual people and their transformation, their growth to maturity as human individuals. But it also means that has to be allowed to work out at the level of our community societies and even, at a national level.
So if slavery is our original sin as a country, as a nation, then it seems to me that a wonderful city like Galveston and the size of the city and the ability to bring the churches of all denominations together in some kind of ministerial alliance and really start these conversations in earnest. And as you so accurately pointed out, it's not about individual racism, or am I a racist, or do I exemplify racist acts and thoughts every day. It's to get people understanding it's about institutional systemic racism. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem. And that they're benefiting from that every day through white privilege and all the other things that go with that. It doesn't say that you're a good or bad person. It's really not about, it's much larger than you. It's much larger than all of us. I mean, it's the system. And I think what we've not wanted to learn and to think about is to, first of all, understand the system. And secondly, to understand how the systems advantage and disadvantage others. And be clear on how that works in our lives every single day. Yeah. I think that's the challenge going forward.
Yeah, and it's difficult. So, I was hesitating to bring too much technical stuff up, but I think the language that best helped me actually come to be able to talk and make sound judgments about some of this comes from the theology of a late Roman Catholic theologian, Bernard Lonergan.
Yes, one of my favorite people.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, well, let's talk about Lonergan. Yeah, so, Lonergan, he doesn't, in his big book, Insight, he doesn't actually talk about sin, but he talks about bias. He doesn't really mean what we all think of when we use the word on a day-to-day basis, but he describes 4 types of bias. There's individual bias, group bias, general bias, and dramatic bias. And it's, you could talk about racism with each of those different forms of bias that he talks about. Individual bias, pretty obvious. It has to do with you as an individual. Why is it that I might seek my own good, even towards the detriment of other people? Right. And then group bias is the same thing at the group level. General bias is the other one that I think is really most interesting for this conversation, because it has to do with more of the way we think and ask questions, which questions we're willing to ask and which answers we're willing to accept. And I think a part of the problem with racism, or tackling systemic racism, or our unwillingness to tackle systemic racism, I should say, is that we've so convinced ourselves that knowing is like taking a look. So if you can't see racism, it must not be a problem. Right. And we should only talk about it if you have an instance of racism. So we don't want to talk about it at the theoretical level. Well, Lonergan would call that an instance of general bias. We don't want to ask these questions of how am I unwittingly complicit? Because we might not like the answers. But of course, the failure to do that isn't just a failure to come to further insights. It's a failure to grow and flourish as people, and it stunts not only individuals, but it stunts our communities. It keeps us from, in a Christian sense, we would just say it keeps us from growing into the image and likeness of God. And I think that's really what we're dealing with. So we have one way of knowing that is very much restricted to what we might call common sense knowing. We want to ask questions about specific instances, and most people are willing to entertain answers and questions of how to overcome that. So like, say, for example, if there was an instance of racism that I could see, say if we were transported back now into the 1960s, most people today, I think, maybe I'm being too generous, they would see, segregated water fountains or a segregated diner or segregated bus, and they would say, "Ooh, that's not good. I can see that there's something wrong. Let's figure out how to fix this." But really the hard work and what we need to do now is to ask those further questions about, what does it mean that myself as a white male with some advanced education, why was I able to do that? Why was I able to envision myself going along this path? Why did I think it was possible? Why didn't I need very much encouragement or it was expected of me sort of thing? Why am I able to navigate some of the way our systems of government and communal life are set up so that I benefit? And I automatically am just able to navigate those systems quite well. Why is it the case that that isn't an equal opportunity, or there is no such thing as, we're all free to choose the same opportunities and make ourselves who we make ourselves? Those questions make people uncomfortable because you can't take a look and see where the injustice is. But I think that's really where we're being called to explore intellectually and theoretically, and then with whatever knowledge we glean, then it's our job to communicate that that in such a way that people are willing to come alongside us.
And I want to just make sure I capture for the audience the individual bias, group bias, general bias. What was the fourth one?
Oh, dramatic bias, which has to do with more psychological, what we might suppress or repress, et cetera. I didn't really touch on that.
All right. No problem. So in a few minutes we have left together, let me ask this question. What is the role throughout Scripture and even today as we're called upon to respond to these issues out of love and charity and wisdom? What is the role of wisdom in all of this? The wisdom community that we've talked about throughout Scripture, who doesn't set themselves apart, but who understands all of these issues and topics from a whole different perspective as to how we as human beings should be able to respond and should be responding. I think a lot of this is caught up in the lack of wisdom and understanding how that aspect of our lives, as we learn it and generate it. And here's my little thing about wisdom, information you take in turning education into knowledge, knowledge into wisdom into action, and do something with it. But we don't do that like we used to in the days, even when I was in Catholic school. The end journey was to get to wisdom. And now that you have wisdom, you're expected to act upon it and do something.
You're responsible.
Change things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So where did we drop off? Where did we lose this whole thing, even from Scripture? Where did we lose with the love of wisdom?
I've got a really long answer for that.
We don't have time. We'll pick it up.
I'll go really quick.
Give me the short version.
I think it has to do with the way we conceive God. And somewhere along the way in the late Middle Ages, we stopped conceiving of God in terms of wisdom and love, and we started conceiving of God in terms of power. So we could come back to what you said about hope a second ago. Is what we hope for just what we think we have the power to achieve? I think that too much still thinks of the problem is out there somewhere. Right. I really like what you just said about wisdom. It's really, how do we become wise people? How do we become people who choose well, who choose a good path for ourselves, a good life? How do we live into this good life? And of course, that takes the hard work. But, I guess, Lonergan has a really simple way of thinking about it. He says, first you have to be attentive. You got to pay attention to what's going on. You have to be intelligent. Well, all he means by that is you have to be willing to ask questions. You have to follow those questions where they go. Then you have to be reasonable. So you have to be willing to listen to the evidence. And then you have to be responsible. And when you do those four things, you have full human knowing, which I think we might call, wisdom. This is human beings living according to the wisdom of God at that point. And when we do that, we might have achieved some semblance of wise living for ourselves. And I like that way of thinking about this because too often, it just is always, us versus them. And it's so easy to leave people behind, right?
Yes.
It's just so easy to identify people. You just think, I've been there, right? They'll never get it. But what do you do when that's like millions of people? That can't be, that just can't be the case. That
Right.
we're just going to say, well, millions of people are just never going to get it. Let's go on ahead without them. And so I think that focus on wisdom, or I like that question, because it comes back to really, how are we forming people that we will have better communities, better conversations, et cetera. Yeah.
So I'll just end on this note, because I think it fits in what you just said. We used to spend a lot of time on what is faith formation and how do we form faith. And it seems to me all those things we used to do well as church, we need to get back to. There was a generation of church, quote unquote, church people, not just pew people, not just people who showed up and sat in pews, but real church people who understood their spirituality in that the more I gain about my faith and my understanding what it means to be a religious person, I am called, I am compelled to do something. And that was my parents' generation, my parents' generation, even my generation. I'm 71 years old. But I don't see that a lot going forward. So I'm gonna have to stop there. I know I threw it out. It was an unfair question to end on. But let me give you just a quick 20 seconds for any closing comments. I really enjoyed you being with us this week. We're gonna have to pick this up again down the road and continue this dialogue. So before we end, any quick thoughts to sum up on?
Oh, I just want to say thank you for having me. I enjoyed this so much, and I would love to continue this conversation with you.
We'll do so. I want to thank you very much, the Reverend Father Jonathan Totty, who is the Rector of Grace Episcopal Church on our wonderful sister city, Galveston, Texas. And you will be hearing more from him, I'm sure, as he makes his mark in Galveston and on the island with all the other faith leaders who really, I think, want to do something. I've talked to a lot of them over this last year, getting ready for this Juneteenth thing, and it was interesting, Father, that the city of Galveston just acknowledged this year.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, people. And they did that, I think, because they knew all eyes on the nation was going to be on them this year because of the way things have moved. And thanks to Congressman Sheila Jackson Lee and to Senator Cornyn for making it happen. And really appreciate their efforts in pursuing and keeping going until it happens. So all those things kind of fell into place this year. All right, we've got to get out of here for this week. I want to thank you all, as always, for being part of this wonderful dialogue for such a time as this, as we try to impart new knowledge, because it is all about living in new knowledge. And if we can do anything to help be your link to living in new knowledge, then that's what we're going to do. Until times we come together in the future, as always, stay safe, be well, and peace, power, and love.